When I was a student, I worked part-time at a 24-hour grocery store. I thought my boss wouldn't assign me to the overnight shift because of my studies, but since I was over 18, I had no choice. One day, I saw that I was scheduled for the shift from midnight to 8 a.m. I wanted to quit, but I needed the money, so I decided to get through it just this once. At midnight, I arrived at the store to take over for a colleague. Half of the lights were turned off to save electricity, and surprisingly, there were still a few customers. By 2 a.m. the store was completely empty, and I started to feel uneasy. Then, a bald man, who seemed like a manager, approached me. He was carrying a bunch of keys and asked me to help organize the pallets in the back warehouse while he watched the front. I assumed he was in charge, so I agreed. When I reached the warehouse, I met another man wearing a manager's vest. He introduced himself as the night manager, and when I mentioned the bald man, he looked puzzled and said he was the only manager on duty. Before we could figure out what was going on, the lights in the store suddenly went out. The manager told me to wait in the warehouse while he checked the situation. As I sat waiting, I heard footsteps approaching, followed by the voice of the bald man calling out for me. It wasn't the manager's voice. Realizing something was wrong, I quietly slipped out of the warehouse and tried to leave the store, but the doors were locked. Just as panic was about to set in, the real manager appeared and quickly unlocked the door, telling me to get out. Once outside, the manager called the police, believing the bald man was trying to rob the store or worse, harm me. I waited in my car, and soon several police cars arrived. They investigated the store, but by then, the bald man had escaped through the warehouse's emergency exit. The security footage later showed him tampering with the store's lights and locking the doors before heading to the warehouse where I was. I shudder to think what could have happened if the real manager hadn't arrived in time. I never worked an overnight shift again, but I stayed at the job for a few more months. I don't know if they ever caught the bald man. I often go grocery shopping twice a week because our household expenses are quite high. My husband works at a tech company, and I stay home to take care of our 3 children, aged 10, 7, and 3. Most of the time, I go to the grocery store near our home, and occasionally, I visit another store nearby. One evening, I was running late and went shopping much later than usual. The store was about to close at 10 p.m., and it was already after 9 p.m. when I rushed over. My kids had been complaining about the lack of food at home, so I had to make a quick grocery run. Usually, I would have my 3-year-old daughter with me, but since my husband was home that evening, I was able to shop alone, a rare luxury. The store was almost empty due to the late hour. After grabbing a cart, I started moving quickly down the aisles, picking up everything on my list. While I was in the cereal aisle, I felt a tap on my shoulder, which startled me. I turned around to see a man, about my height, wearing a gray hoodie. He smiled and apologized for scaring me, then asked where I had found a particular bag of chips that was in my cart. He said he couldn't find it anywhere in the aisle. I politely pointed out the aisle where I found it, but he insisted he had checked and couldn't locate it. So, I led him to the exact spot where the chips were, and he thanked me with an awkward grin and bad breath. As I was about to head back to my cart, he started chatting with me about the chips, explaining in detail why he liked them. It was something trivial, like the ingredients. I tried to make it obvious that I was inching back to my cart, but he didn't take the hint. The moment he paused and suddenly said, "You're really pretty," I felt uncomfortable. I quickly thanked him and told him I needed to finish my shopping before the store closed. As I walked away, he continued to follow me, trying to keep up the conversation. I finally had to tell him politely that I just wanted to shop in peace. He seemed to get the message and walked off. However, as I finished the rest of my shopping, I noticed him circling the aisles, sometimes stopping to glance at me. I became increasingly uneasy and sped through the rest of my list. At the checkout, I was almost done when the man appeared again, now with only 2 or 3 items in his hands, standing in line directly behind me. He didn't speak anymore, but I could feel his gaze on me. After paying, I pushed my cart outside, and as I was loading my groceries into the car, I noticed him lingering in the parking lot. He got into an old, beat-up car but didn't turn it on right away. He just sat there, staring at me. Once I finished, I got into my car, started it, and drove off. I looked into my rearview mirror a few times and didn't see anyone following me, so I felt relieved. But as I approached my house, I noticed a car driving slowly down the street with its headlights off. It was the same old car from the parking lot. The driver parked a few houses down, watching me. I quickly went inside and called for my husband. He rushed out to check, but by then, the car had already driven away. A few nights later, we were already in bed when we heard rustling outside near the side gate. I woke my husband up, and he went to the window to check. He saw someone trying to open the gate. When the man noticed my husband looking, he ran off. My husband grabbed a bat and chased after him. He returned shortly after, saying he saw the same old car speeding away. We called the police, and an officer arrived within minutes. I gave them the best description I could of the man and the car. Fortunately, the man never returned after seeing my husband chase him with a bat, but the thought of him knowing where we live still makes me uneasy. I used to work as a night restock worker at a supermarket in a somewhat rural town. The store was called Great American. It was the biggest and best supermarket in the area. My shift would begin as soon as the store closed at 10 p.m. and I worked from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. at the latest, restocking shelves and organizing everything before the next operating day. Of course, I had the keys to the store after hours, and it was usually a team of two, myself and one other worker, either Terry, Carter, or Alfonso. Tonight, I was supposed to be working with Terry. I arrived at the store and let myself into the back, where all the inventory yet to be stocked was kept. I started my work using a pallet jack to bring a whole pallet of boxes out to the shopping floor. I began in the bread and nuts aisle, rotating the older loaves to the front and putting the newer loaves in the back. About halfway through, I realized I hadn't seen Terry yet. I walked to the back of the store, where we left our belongings and inventory. Terry wasn't there yet. I left the back door cracked open with a door stopper for him when he would arrive and then return to work for another half hour. However, there was still no sign of Terry. I went back to the storage area, but he wasn't there. I also noticed that the back door was now shut. I assumed Terry must have arrived and shut the door behind him. When I opened the back door, I saw the door stopper outside, which I thought was strange. Why would Terry have kicked it outside instead of bringing it in? I called out his name, but my voice just echoed through the empty room. He didn't respond, so I called him on his phone. Terry picked up, sounding like he was in bed. He told me he wasn't coming in tonight because he was sick. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. I told Terry that someone had kicked the door stopper off, but he casually suggested it could have just come undone by itself. No one else was scheduled to work that night. After wishing Terry to feel better, I hung up the phone. I wasn't entirely convinced the door stopper had come loose on its own because I had wedged it under the door quite tightly. Just to be sure, I did a quick check around the store to make sure no one else was inside. After not finding anyone, I went back to work, although I felt a slight unease the entire time. While I was stocking the remainder of the bread, I heard a loud noise echo across the shopping floor. At that moment, I knew someone had to be there. I quickly got up and moved to the middle aisle that intersected all the other aisles. I stood still for a moment, looking straight down the aisle, and on the opposite side of the store, in the dairy section, a man dressed in black walked by, staring down my direction. My heart dropped. It reminded me of that scene from the movie Signs, where the alien walks past the birthday party. I had to think logically it could be someone filling in for Terry's shift, someone my boss hadn't told me about. I quickly walked down the center aisle, shouting "Excuse me," loudly. I looked down every aisle I passed, heading toward the front of the store, but when I reached the end of one of those aisles, I saw the man again. He was standing still at the end, fully facing in my direction. When he saw me, he stepped out of sight, heading in the direction I had just come from. I shouted "Excuse me" again and began running down the aisle to catch up. I hadn't gotten a good look at his face yet. When I got to the front of the aisle near the cash registers, I looked down the next aisle and saw him once more, at the end of the bread aisle. This time, half of his body was hidden behind a shelf, and his mouth was hanging open. He waved at me without saying anything, and his face was utterly unsettling. I attempted to speak to him again, asking, "Who are you?" but he disappeared behind the shelf. That was it for me. I wasn't getting paid enough for this. I went outside to sit in my car and called my boss. I told him there was a strange guy wandering around the store. He instructed me to either get him out of there or call the police. There was no way I was about to physically confront some crazy guy, so I dialed 911. I stayed in my car until the police arrived. When an officer showed up, I explained the situation, and we both entered the store together. As we searched, we saw the man again, standing at the end of another aisle. He was still behaving oddly, standing there as if playing some kind of game. When the police officer commanded him to come over, the man complied. He was handcuffed, but his behavior was still unnerving. He smiled constantly, licking his lips and glancing at me frequently. His eyes had huge dark circles under them. The only words he spoke were to the police officer, saying he was just looking for a snack. Even as he was being escorted out, the man kept giving me this threatening, menacing smile, one that I haven't been able to forget to this day. Afterward, I continued my work, but needless to say, I never left any of the doors open again.